She was a queen. She had a crown, a throne, and a husband who looked through her like she was smoke. For years, Celine Ravarin survived a marriage built on ice and political convenience, and said nothing. Smiled at the right banquets, wore the right gowns, played the perfect invisible queen while another woman slept in her husband's warmth. But survival has a price, and tonight, someone decided she'd paid enough. They want her dead. Drop your city in the comments and let's ride this out together. Because what happens next will break everything you thought you knew about power. The banquet hall smelled like roasted boar and expensive wine, and the particular kind of rot that only grows when powerful people gather in one room and call it celebration. Celine sat at the far end of the high table, which was where Darius always put her. Close enough to look legitimate, far enough that no one confused her presence for importance. She had learned, in 6 years of this marriage, to read the room like a battlefield map. Which lord was watching the king too eagerly? Which lady was whispering behind her cup? Which servant moved too fast or too slow, or with the careful, measured step of someone carrying a secret? Tonight, she read 17 separate conversations in the span of 20 minutes, and none of them included her. The hall was long and vaulted, built from black stone quarried out of the northern cliffs 3 generations back. The kind of architecture that was meant to make men feel small and kings feel necessary. Torch brackets ran the length of the walls. The fire jumped in drafts that came through the high windows, and every time it jumped, the shadows of the assembled nobility lurched sideways across the stone, a room full of people whose silhouettes looked nothing like their faces. Darius sat at the center. He always sat at the center. Even his posture was a kind of declaration. Spine straight, jaw cut, eyes moving across the room with the practiced calm of a man who had never once doubted that the room was his. He was broad through the shoulder and dark through the hair, and there had been a time, a very distant and mostly stupid time, when Celine had looked at him and felt something move in her chest. She had been 19. She had known nothing about the anatomy of power, and even less about the particular cruelty of men who had too much of it. That was 6 years ago. She was not 19 anymore. Morel sat 2 seats from the king. She was not supposed to sit at the high table. Protocol was clear on that. A king's mistress attended court functions in a secondary position, visible but subordinate, ornamental without being structural. But Darius had stopped caring about protocol where Morel was concerned somewhere around the 2nd year of the marriage. And by the 3rd year, he had stopped pretending to care, which was somehow worse. Morel had copper-bright hair and a smile that moved like it was calculating something. And she wore a gown tonight the same deep red as a bruise 2 days old. She was laughing at something the lord to her left had said. She did not look at Celine. She rarely did. That was strategy. Morel was many things that people underestimated. Lazy was not one of them. Celine drank water instead of wine. She had done this for 3 years, quietly, without announcement, after she noticed that her head felt cleaner in the mornings and her instincts felt sharper, and the world around her became easier to read when she was not softening the edges with fermented grape. No one had ever asked why. That told her most of what she needed to know about how closely anyone was watching. Lady Verena sat at the secondary table, 12 feet away, and she was watching. Her stepmother had aged the way certain predatory animals aged, not into softness, but into a kind of concentrated stillness that made them more dangerous rather than less. She was 61 years old, and she wore it like armor. Silver hair pinned without vanity, eyes the color of old pewter, flat and uninflected. She had never pretended to love Celine, which Celine had always found, in a dark and sideways fashion, more honest than the alternatives. Verena had married her father when Celine was 12, gotten everything she wanted out of that arrangement by the time Celine was 15, and had been quietly repositioning her pieces ever since. Celine watched her stepmother's hands around her wine cup. They were still. They were always still. That was the thing about Verena that no one else seemed to notice. Most people moved through anxiety, through excitement, through the small betrayals of the body that happened when the mind was running calculations. Verena did not. Verena was still the way a knife is still when it is waiting to be used. The feast moved through its courses. Celine ate without tasting. The lord to her right attempted conversation twice, and she gave him answers that were technically complete and left him with nothing to work with. Across the hall, musicians played something low and repetitive. A lord in the corner was already drunk enough that his laugh came out too large for the space it occupied, and the people nearest him shifted almost imperceptibly away. It was the third course when the cup reached Morel. Celine did not see who poured it. She was looking the other direction, tracking a conversation between two Eastern lords that seemed to involve land rights and veiled aggression. She heard the pour, the soft weight of liquid into crystal, the particular sound of a cup being set back down with care. She turned her head without urgency. Morel lifted the cup, smiled at something, drank. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then Morel went very still in a way that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with the body receiving news the mind had not yet processed. Her hand came down from the cup slowly. Her face, which was never anything less than composed, moved through 3 expressions in the span of a breath: confusion, recognition, something Celine would later think looked almost like relief. Her chair scraped stone as her body lost its argument with gravity, and then she was on the floor and the hall was chaos. Celine did not move. Not because she was cold, not because she didn't understand what she was watching. She didn't move because she had spent 6 years in this hall, learning that the first few seconds of chaos were diagnostic, that you could learn more about a room by watching how people reacted to a crisis than by anything they said before one arrived. So she sat, and she watched, and she catalogued. Darius was on his feet. He moved to Morel with the speed of a man whose body had already decided before his brain completed the order. His face was a thing Celine had never seen before, stripped clean of the careful architecture of kingship, just raw animal fear and something that was not grief yet, but was moving toward it fast. He went to his knees on the stone floor in his banquet clothes without once registering what that meant. "Get a physician," he said. His voice was flat and controlled, and she could hear the effort it took. "Get one now." Celine looked at Verena. Her stepmother had not moved, had not stood, had not reached for anyone. She sat at her secondary table with both hands wrapped around her cup, watching the scene unfold with that pewter-flat gaze, and she was not quite smiling. No, that would have been too legible, but there was something in the arrangement of her features that Celine recognized from the 17 years she had spent in close proximity to that face. Verena was satisfied. It was the only word for it, and in the space of a heartbeat, Celine understood that she was looking at the opening move of something that had been in preparation for a very long time. She turned away from her stepmother. She kept her face neutral. She counted her breaths. The physician arrived in 4 minutes. Morel was breathing but unconscious. Her copper hair fanned out across the black stone floor in a way that Celine thought, with the kind of cold clarity she had come to rely on, would look very dramatic to everyone in the room. 2 lords helped lift her. Darius walked beside her, not looking at anything except the woman in his arms, and as he passed the high table, he did not look at his wife. He had not looked at his wife in 8 months. The hall emptied in degrees, the way halls do after something violent happens. Not all at once, but in clusters, people finding reasons and exits, the music stopping mid-phrase like a sentence interrupted. Celine remained seated. The servants began moving with the careful, purposeful efficiency of people who have been trained to work around catastrophe, clearing plates that hadn't been finished, resetting order in small visible ways because that was the only order available to them. "My queen." She looked up. It was Brant, her head steward. 60, balding, with the kind of loyalty that came not from love but from long service and practical assessment. He was looking at her with something in his eyes that was not quite warning, and not quite fear, but was somewhere between them, existing in the uncomfortable territory of a man who knows more than he can say. "The king asks that you remain in the hall." "Does he?" "He sends no further message." Celine turned her cup in her hands once, slowly. "Then I'll remain." Brant held her gaze for a half-second longer than was strictly necessary. Then he stepped back and was gone. She sat alone at the high table in the emptying hall and felt, with the instincts she had spent 6 years sharpening because they were the only weapon she was allowed to carry, that the walls were closing. Darius returned in 2 hours. He did not come alone. He brought 4 members of the royal council, Lords Ashby, Carrel, Doon, and the High Marshal, a man named Vorant who had the specific look of someone who had made peace with ugly work. He brought 6 royal guards. He brought Lady Verena. Celine stood when they entered, not because protocol required it, but because she was not going to be seated when whatever this was began. Darius stopped 10 feet from her. In 2 hours, something had happened to his face. The fear she had seen on the floor beside Morel had processed into something harder, something that had found a shape to take. He looked at her the way he used to look at border lords who had violated treaty, with the particular cold fury of a man who had decided the verdict before the proceedings began. "The physicians believe Morel was poisoned," he said, "the wine in her cup." "I understand. Several witnesses have come forward." His voice did not waver. "They place you near the service corridor at the second course. They saw you give instruction to a servant." Celine held very still. "That is not what happened." "You have an explanation." "I was at this table for the entirety of the feast. I did not visit the service corridor. I spoke to no servant about wine or about anything that could have reached Morel's cup." 6 witnesses say otherwise. 6 witnesses. The number was not accidental. 1 witness could be a mistake or a grudge. 6 witnesses was architecture. She looked at Verena, who stood slightly behind the council lord, still as a standing stone, watching with that expression that was not quite anything. "Then 6 witnesses are lying," Celine said. Her voice came out level. She was genuinely impressed with herself. Darius took a step toward her, and she did not step back. She had made that decision, she realized, a long time ago, and it took no effort now. She simply did not retreat from him, because she had decided that would not be a thing she did anymore, and the decision had set like solder and was permanent. "Morel might die," he said. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Don't." The word came out jagged. "Don't give me the court voice, Celine. Not now." "Then tell me what voice you'd prefer when you're standing in front of me with a verdict already written and calling it an inquiry." Something moved behind his eyes. She could not tell what it was. In 6 years she had learned to read him reasonably well, and there were still depths she could not parse. Not because he was complicated, but because some men constructed themselves around their appetites so completely that their interior became a kind of closed country with no reliable roads in. "The council is convening tonight," he said. "The council." She looked at the 4 men standing slightly behind him. Ashby, who had voted against her father's land rights 11 years ago. Carell, whose trade interests conflicted with territories Celine had ties to. Dune, who smiled at her at court functions with the particular warmth of a man who has decided you are not worth calculating. Vorant, who was Darius's man from the bone out. "I want to speak with you alone," she said. "There is nothing to be gained from—" "I want to speak with you alone," she said again. Her voice was still level. She watched him. "You owe me that. Whatever you've already decided, whatever they've already told you, you owe me 5 minutes without an audience. I am still your queen." The word "still" landed in the room with more weight than she intended. Darius was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the council. "Wait outside." Verant's jaw tightened slightly. "My king, the situation—" "Outside." They went. Verena last, and as she passed Celine, the older woman did not look at her. Just walked past with that careful, unrushed step, and the door closed, and Celine and Darius were alone in the hall for the first time in months. The torches had burned lower. The shadows were longer. Someone had left a half-empty wine decanter on the table, and neither of them acknowledged it. "You already believe it," Celine said. Not an accusation, just a fact she was touching to see what it was made of. Darius turned away from her, walked 3 paces, came back. He could not be still when he was struggling. That was one of the things she knew about him. It was possibly the most human thing about him. 6 witnesses. 6 witnesses that Verena assembled. His eyes sharpened. "That's— Listen to me." She kept her voice flat, because flat was what was available to her. "I know how this looks. I know what the evidence claims. I also know that I have spent 6 years in this court watching your stepmother's allies position themselves on the council, in the judiciary, in the Capitol Guard. I know that Morel is not simply your mistress. She is Verena's instrument. And if Morel is damaged tonight, it is because Verena decided the damage was useful. You're saying Verena poisoned her own piece on the board. I'm saying that a woman who trades in other people's usefulness would absolutely sacrifice one of them if it bought her something bigger." She held his gaze. "And what it buys her is me in a box." Darius was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before, and she searched it for something to work with. A crack, a door, any gap between the verdict he'd carried in and the man who was standing in front of her now. She searched for something that looked like doubt. She found it, and then she watched him decide not to use it. "The council will convene in an hour," he said. His voice had gone back to the flat administrative register he used for state functions. Something had closed in him. She had watched it close. She had not been able to stop it. "You'll be held in your quarters until then." "Darius? This is not—" He stopped, pressed his jaw together. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet in a way that was worse than loud. "This is not something I can look away from. Not with 6 witnesses. Not with the whole court watching." "So it's about what the court is watching." "Everything is about what the court is watching. You know that. You've always known that." Celine looked at him for a long moment, at the face she had woken up beside for 2 years before he stopped coming to her chambers, at the jawline and the careful eyes and the particular arrangement of a man who had chosen power so many times that it had become the only choice he could see. "I know," she said, "that I am innocent. I know that you would say that. I know that you know the difference." He looked away first. She did not find that satisfying. She found it devastating in the way that only pointless things are devastating. The grief of a door closing on a room that was already empty. The guard came for her 30 minutes later. The council took 4 hours. Celine was not present. She was in her quarters with a guard posted at both doors, and she paced the length of the room in the dark because she did not want to call for torches and let them see her consuming light like she was afraid. She paced, and she thought, and she built the architecture of what she knew from the materials available. Verena had been planning this for years. The placement of allies in critical positions. That took years of patient work. The kind of work that required keeping an end goal in mind across seasons and marriages and shifting political landscapes. Verena had that kind of patience. Celine had watched it operating since she was 12 years old, had misread it for most of her childhood as mere coldness, had only in adulthood understood that it was strategy. What did Verena want? The simple answer was Celine gone, but Verena had never been a simple answer woman. Getting Celine removed from power was useful, but it was means, not end. The end was the throne itself, or some significant piece of it. Celine had no children, a deliberate arrangement on her part, a choice she had made quietly and would not undo because bringing a child into this marriage had always seemed to her like using an innocent as a buffer. Without an heir, the throne's succession was uncertain. If Darius fell, and men who ruled by force rather than legitimacy had a way of eventually falling, the court would fracture along factional lines, and whoever had spent years building the deepest alliances would be positioned to take the largest piece. Verena had spent years building alliances. She thought about Morel, thought about the woman on the floor, the copper hair, the expression she had worn in that brief window between standing and falling, the expression that had looked almost like relief. What had Morel known? What had she been told, and what had she been offered, and what had she been promised? And had she agreed to be the sacrifice, or had she been one of the pieces that didn't know until too late that it was being moved toward the edge? Celine did not know. She filed the question. Brant came to her door at the 3rd hour. The guard let him pass. He was senior court staff. He had access, and whoever had arranged this evening had not yet bothered to close that particular gap. Brant came in and stood just inside the door with the expression she had seen in the hall, that space between warning and fear. "The council has voted," he said. He said it quietly. He said it in the voice of a man delivering news he would have preferred not to carry. "Tell me." He looked at her. For a moment he was very old and very tired, and the loyalty she had always relied on in him shifted slightly into something that was about to hurt. "Attempted murder of a royal consort," he said. "The charge carries an imperial sentence." Imperial sentence? That was the language used for the category of punishment that did not involve cells or exile. Celine heard it and processed it and felt her body go somewhere very still that her mind was still catching up to. "How long?" she said. "Before sunrise." He could not hold her gaze. He was looking at the floor. "The king has signed it." She stood in the dark room and breathed, in, out. The same body she had lived in for 25 years, the same hands, the same bones, the same mind she had spent years sharpening against circumstance. Before sunrise. "Brant," she said, "my queen, you've served this court for 30 years. 32. In 32 years, she kept her voice steady. She kept it steady the same way she had kept everything steady for 6 years, the way you keep a lamp burning in a wind. Not by eliminating the wind, but by cupping the flame with your body, wearing it like weight. In 32 years, have you ever known me to be stupid? He looked up. No, he said. I have not. Then hear me. What happened tonight was built before tonight. The witnesses, the evidence, the council's alignment, this was constructed. Verena built it. I need you to find whatever crack is available in this and push. My queen, the king has signed. I know what he signed. She did not raise her voice. I'm not asking you to reverse the sentence. I'm asking you to find the crack. Talk to the servants. Find the one who actually handled the wine service near Morel's table and ask them what they saw. Do it tonight. Do it fast. Brant held still for a long moment. Then he pressed one fist briefly to his chest in the old court gesture. Not the formal one, the older one, the one that had survived from 3 dynasties back and meant something closer to, I stand with you, than any formal affirmation managed. Before sunrise, he said quietly. Yes? He went. Celine turned back to the window. The capital spread below in darkness and scattered torchlight, the dense geometry of rooftops and streets, and the faint silver thread of the river 3 miles out. Somewhere in this city, in the official registry buildings and the court archives and the legal chambers, her death warrant was being copied into multiple records. Before sunrise. The language was chosen for maximum efficiency. Not dawn, which suggested a natural opening, but before sunrise, which was a closing. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold stone of the window frame. The stone was honest in the way cold things are honest. It did not pretend to be warm, did not perform comfort, was simply what it was, and there was something in that she could use. She breathed against it. Then she straightened. She spent the remaining hours doing what she had always done when the walls closed. She moved through the information she had, found the edges of what she could control, and placed her focus there. She thought about Brant and what he might find. She thought about Darius and the cracks she had seen before he closed it. She thought about Verena and the satisfaction on that still face and tried to find within it the shape of the next move, because there was always a next move, because people who had built this much architecture around a single night did not stop at a single night. She also thought, in the cold and honest dark, about the particular texture of a life that had been spent surviving rather than living, and what it meant that this was where that life had delivered her, and whether the calculus had ever been in her favor, or whether she had always been moving toward this room, this window, this sentence that someone else had signed. She did not find an answer. She was not sure the question had one. They came for her at the hour before dawn. 6 guards in the royal colors, black and deep green, vein colors, the colors she had worn for 6 years as though she belonged to the house. The captain was a man named Sorn, who she knew by sight and had always found to be professional in the particular way that made him useful to people issuing ugly orders. He was professional now. He did not meet her eyes. My queen, he said. The title was operational, not personal. You'll come with us. She was dressed. She had dressed herself in the night, had chosen carefully, had picked plain dark wool over the court gowns, had done her own hair without a maid because the last thing she wanted was the performance of being groomed for a public execution. She wore no jewelry except the plain copper bracelet her father had given her when she was 7, and she put that on last and felt the weight of it on her wrist like something to hold on to. She walked out of the room without being told to. The capital streets at that hour were not empty. They never were. Capitals bred a population of people who lived and worked in the dark hours, merchants and laborers, and the category of individuals who had reasons to move without daylight. They cleared from the procession as it moved through the main corridor, not from respect, but from the instinct of people who had learned long ago that royal business in the dark hours was not a thing you placed yourself adjacent to. Celine walked in the center of the guard formation, and she kept her spine straight because that was a decision she had made and it required very little effort now. The execution square was in the old quarter of the capital, the part of the city that had been built before the current dynasty and still wore the older architecture, lower buildings, wider stones, a different proportion to the streets that made everything feel slightly more human. The square itself was large and open, and at this hour it was full of light from the torches the court had arranged along its perimeter, and it was also full of people, They had called a witness crowd. That was how imperial sentences worked. Public witnessing was the mechanism that made a sentence binding, that transformed a king's decision into a permanent legal fact. The crowd was assembled, several hundred people in varying states of alertness, the nobility and the council lords and the military officers, and behind them the civilian population that had gathered from the surrounding streets, drawn by torchlight, and the particular human instinct that makes people move toward events rather than away from them. Darius stood at the center of the square's raised platform. He wore full court dress, black and green, the formal version with the gold border, the crown that was reserved for state occasions. He looked like a king. He was looking at her as the guard formation brought her into the square, and she looked back at him. And for a single moment, everything else in the square went quiet in her perception, and it was only the two of them, the distance between them, the 6 years between them, the sentence he had signed. She found the crack again. It was still there. It was not enough. She was brought to the base of the platform, and the guards positioned her, and she was aware of the crowd around her, the weight of it, the sound of it, the smell of many bodies in a torch-lit space in the cold hour before dawn. She did not look at them. She looked at Darius. Vorant, the High Marshal, stepped forward with the formal document. He read it in the carrying voice trained officials develop over years, loud enough for the square's edges, clear enough for the record. Charges of attempted murder, conspiracy against a royal consort, evidence witnessed and sworn, council verdict unanimous. She listened to the words and felt them going past her. Underneath the words was something else, a kind of structural sound, the sound of a building that has been compromised and is making noises that only someone paying close attention would notice. She was paying close attention. She looked for Verena, found her, standing to the right of the platform, in the formal witness position, dressed in gray, both hands folded. Still as a knife. And then she looked because she could not help it, because some part of her was still looking for a way through. She looked at the crack in Darius. He was looking at Vorant. His jaw was set. His hands were at his sides. He was performing the specific stillness of a man who has decided something and is making his body comply with it. And the performance was good, but she had spent 6 years learning the original, and she could see the gap between what he was doing and what stillness actually looked like. He was not certain. He had signed the document and assembled the square and put on the crown, and he was not certain, and the knowledge of that sat in her chest like a coal, hot and useless, because certain or not certain, the words were being spoken, and the space was being prepared, and the blade was at the far end of the platform. And uncertainty in a king did not reverse a sentence. Uncertainty in a king just meant the wrong person died with a more complicated regret behind it, Verant finished. The crowd was quiet with the particular anticipation that had no word for it. Not excitement, not grief, something older and more basic, the animal attention that comes before something irreversible. Celine looked at Darius one more time. "You know," she said. Her voice came out level, not loud. She was not performing to the square, she was speaking to the man. "You know what this is? You signed it anyway." His jaw moved, just barely. "The sentence is recorded," Vorant said, "because the queen is to be—" The sky changed. It was not metaphor. The sky actually changed. The quality of the light, the temperature of the air, something that moved across the square, like the pressure shift before a storm. Except there were no clouds and the dawn was still an hour away. People heard it before they understood what they were hearing. A sound like wind, but too ordered, too purposeful, coming from the north. And then the darkness at the northern edge of the square filled with riders. They came in hard and fast and in number, and they wore black, troll, not the black and green of the Vane Court, but a different black, deeper, northern, the black of a standard that Celine had seen only in political documents and border reports. They came into the square at a pace that forced the crowd to clear or be run through, and the crowd cleared, and the guards at the square's perimeter turned and raised and looked to Sorn, and Sorn looked to Darius, and Darius went very still. At the front of the riders, on a horse that was too large for a reasonable man's horse, and ridden like it was an extension of the body, was a figure that even at distance communicated something that had no comfortable word, not authority, which was granted, not power, which was accumulated, but something more primary than either, the thing that both of those derived from. He stopped 20 feet from the platform. His riders spread to either side in a formation that had the disciplined geometry of a military posture without being one. His face, when she could see it, was not what she expected. She had expected old. She had expected the specific grotesquerie that stories attach to feared men. He was not old and he was not grotesque. He was perhaps 35, angular through the jaw, with eyes that even across the distance she could see were the specific gray of a sky that is deciding whether or not to become a storm. A scar ran from his left temple to the corner of his jaw, not the decorative scar of a man who wanted people to know he'd survived something, but the functional scar of a man who had simply survived it and had not subsequently spent time thinking about what it looked like. He looked at the platform, at the blade, at her, at Darius. And then he spoke, and his voice carried across the square in the particular way that voices carry when the person producing them has never once in their life needed to ask for a room's attention. Step back from the queen. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a stone hits water, a moment before the ripple, before the world processes what has changed. Darius stepped forward to the platform's edge. His voice was controlled and it cost him something. "You are in the capital of the vain empire, Draven, under whose authority, my own." Kael Draven said it without heat. He said it the way someone states a direction on a map. "I don't need another kind." And the square held its breath, and the torches jumped in the pre-dawn wind, and Celine stood between an execution blade and a northern king and understood, with the bone-deep clarity of someone who has just seen the board shift in a way that changed everything, that whatever had been true 20 minutes ago was no longer true, and that whatever came next was going to be far more dangerous. The square did not move. That was the thing Celine noticed first. Not the riders, not the torches, not the sound of several hundred people making the collective calculation of whether to breathe. The thing she noticed was the stillness, the specific quality of it, the way the whole square had locked into place the moment Kael Draven's voice finished moving through it. She had been in this court long enough to know the difference between a room that was quiet because it was peaceful and a room that was quiet because something had arrived that was larger than the people in it. This was the second kind. Darius had not stepped back. He stood at the edge of the platform with the crown on his head and the execution document in Varant's hands, and his face arranged into the particular expression of a man who understood that stepping back was not an option he could take and remain what he was. 6 years of watching that face had taught her to read it with precision, and what she read now was the arithmetic of a king calculating what a retreat would cost him in front of his court, his council, and the several hundred witnesses he had assembled specifically to make this moment permanent. He had assembled them to make her death permanent. Now they were witnessing something else. "You're a long way from your territory," Darius said. His voice was even. It cost him. "And you're in my capital without invitation or declaration." Kael had not dismounted. He sat the large horse with the ease of a man who had spent more hours in a saddle than in any building, and he looked at Darius with the gray eyes and the scarred jaw and the specific patience of someone who was not waiting for permission to speak, but was deciding how much to say. "I don't need an invitation to stop a murder," Kael said. "This is a lawful sentence. Show me the evidence." The word landed clean and flat, and the silence after it had a different texture, the silence of a challenge rather than a command. Celine watched Darius's jaw. She watched Vorant shift his weight by a fraction. She watched Verena, who had not moved from her position at the right of the platform, and whose stillness had taken on a new quality, not the satisfied stillness of a woman watching her architecture perform, but the careful stillness of a woman reassessing her foundation. "The evidence was heard by the Royal Council," Darius said. "The verdict is unanimous. The sentence is signed. By you." "That's how sovereignty works." "Yes," Kael said. "It is." He said it without irony, without edge, with the flat weight of a man acknowledging a fact while making clear he did not consider it the last word on the subject. He looked at Celine then, directly, for the first time. She held the look and did not flinch from it, and he held it for 3 seconds before he turned back to Darius. "The queen stands accused of poisoning your consort." "She does." "Is the consort dead?" A pause. Short, but present. "She is unconscious." "So your queen is sentenced to die," Kael said, "for a murder that has not occurred." The crowd shifted. It was small. A sound, a movement at the edge of perception. But Celine felt it the way she felt everything in this square, with the hyper-awareness of a person for whom every variable was potentially the one that mattered. Darius heard it too. She could tell by the way his shoulders moved, the almost imperceptible adjustment of a man who had just registered that the room's weight had shifted. "The charge is attempted murder," Vorant said. He stepped forward with the professional insertion of a man whose job was to fill these gaps. "The sentence is proportionate and legally, I wasn't talking to you." Cale did not look at Vorant when he said it. He kept his eyes on Darius, and Vorant went quiet with the specific silence of a man who has been reminded of exactly where he sits in a particular arrangement of power. Darius stepped down from the platform. He walked the 15 feet between the platform and Kael's horse, and he did it without hurrying, because hurrying would have been a different kind of retreat. He stopped at a distance that was close enough to be a statement and far enough to be safe, and he looked up at the man on the horse. "Step out of this square," Darius said. "Take your riders. This is the last time I give you that opportunity with any courtesy attached to it." Cale looked down at him. Something moved in his face that was not quite amusement and not quite contempt. It was something in the territory between them, something that acknowledged the effort without being moved by it. "The Queen comes with me," he said, "until the evidence is independently examined. She is under imperial sentence. Then your empire can file a grievance." Cale's eyes moved briefly to Celine, then back. "She walks out of the square, or I take her out of it. Those are your options." "You don't have the authority. I have 30 armed men at your back, and a treaty that says I have standing in any matter involving potential miscarriage of imperial law." He let that land. "You signed that treaty 3 years ago. Check the archives." Celine watched Darius's face process this. She watched him locate the treaty in his memory, assess its language, calculate what invoking it publicly would cost against what dismissing it publicly would cost, and arrive at the specific expression of a man who has realized he is in a corner that someone else built. "This isn't over," Darius said. "No," Cale agreed. "It isn't." 1. She rode north before the sun came up. They gave her a horse, a dark bay, solid and responsive, better than anything in the Vane stables, and she rode in the center of the formation with Kael's men around her and the capital falling behind in the dark. She did not look back. Looking back was not something she was going to do, not because the past did not matter, but because she had learned, somewhere in the years of surviving that place, that looking back while moving forward produced nothing useful. You used what was behind you as information. You did not use it as a view. The road north was wide and cut through farmland for the first hour, then lifted into the terrain where the land started to remember. It was connected to harder country. Hills first, then the suggestion of the ridge country that led eventually into the northern territories. The air changed. It got colder and sharper and smelled like stone and water, rather than the wood smoke and refuse smell of the capital. Celine breathed it and felt something in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. She settled eventually on alive. Cale rode at the front of the formation for the first 2 hours without speaking to her. She did not attempt conversation. She was assembling information, watching his riders, watching how they moved and communicated and deferred, watching what they looked at and what they ignored. Military formations developed cultures the way any organization did, and those cultures told you things about the person at the top that the person at the top would never directly tell you. What she saw: discipline without rigidity. Men who watched the terrain rather than each other. No performative deference to Kael, but no testing either. Just a settled acknowledgement of function that had the quality of something long established. These were not men performing loyalty. These were men who had simply decided, and the deciding was old enough that it no longer required maintenance. That told her something. At the 3rd hour, when the sky was beginning to lighten in the east behind them, Kael dropped back through the formation until he was riding beside her. He did not announce himself. He simply arrived. She looked at him in the growing light. The scar was more visible in daylight. It ran clean, old, the skin along it slightly lighter than the rest of his face. His hands on the reins were large and scarred across the knuckles, and he rode with the total physical ease of a man whose body had long ago resolved its negotiations with physical effort. "You're not going to ask," he said. "I'm going to ask," Celine said. "I'm deciding the order." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. not quite a smile, an acknowledgement. "Why?" she said. "Why what, specifically?" "You were in the capital. That wasn't coincidence. You don't travel to another empire's capital on a ride and happen to arrive at an execution. You came because you knew. How did you know, and why does it matter to you?" He looked at the road for a moment. "I have sources in Vane's court." "Who?" "Not yours to know yet." She filed that. "And it matters to you because your stepmother has been building something for 4 years that crosses my border interests." He said it without inflection, without the performance of importance. "She has been placing allies in positions adjacent to northern trade routes. Quiet work. Patient work. The kind of work you don't notice until you notice the shape of it." He looked at her. "You were the piece that needed removing to complete the next phase. I removed myself from the equation by removing you from the execution." Celine processed this. It was honest, she thought. Brutally, usefully honest. The kind of honesty that did not dress itself up as something warmer. He had not come for her. He had come for a strategic problem, and she was the mechanism he had used to address it. That was not comfortable information, but it was clean information, and she had always preferred clean. "So I'm useful to you," she said. "Yes." "In what capacity?" "Alive and informed," he said. "You've spent 6 years in the center of that court. You know its architecture better than anyone outside it. I need to understand what Verena has built and where its load-bearing walls are. And in exchange, you stay alive." He let that sit for a moment, which seems like a reasonable exchange given what the alternative was 2 hours ago. Celine looked at the road ahead, at the riders in front of them, at the hills building on the horizon. She felt the copper bracelet against her wrist. She thought about Brant, who she had left behind in a city that had just watched a northern king ride her out of an execution square, and what that was going to cost him, and whether he was going to be smart enough to make himself invisible in the hours that followed. She thought about Darius, about the crack in him that had not been enough. "You should know," she said, "that I am not going to be useful in the way you're imagining." Kael looked at her. "You're imagining someone who survived 6 years by being careful and watchful and compliant," she said. "That's accurate. But the version of me that walked out of that execution square is not the version that walked in. I'll give you what I know about Verena's architecture, but I'm not a source you manage. I'm not a piece on your board. If that's what you're looking for, you need to renegotiate your expectations before we get wherever we're going." The silence that followed had weight. She held it without adjusting. She had said the thing clearly, and she was not going to sand its edges now. Kael studied her for a long moment with those storm-gray eyes, and whatever he was looking for in her face she could not tell, but she did not perform anything for him to find. She just looked back. "Noted," he said. It was not agreement, it was not dismissal. It was a man receiving information and storing it for later assessment, and she recognized that mechanism because she had used it herself for years. He was doing what she did. She found that, in an unsettling and functional way, useful. The fortress appeared in the late afternoon. It was not beautiful in any way that word was typically applied to buildings. It was built into the side of a ridge, black stone and older timber, with the proportions of something that had been expanded over generations by people who cared about function and had never once thought about whether a visitor's first impression was favorable. The walls were high and the gate was iron, and the approach road was flanked by terrain that would have made a military advance extremely expensive. Celine looked at it and thought, this is a place built by someone who expected to be attacked. That told her something about the man riding beside her. The gates opened before they reached them. The courtyard inside was active. Stable hands, guards, a cluster of what appeared to be administrative staff, who dispersed efficiently as the riders came through. Everything moved with the same quality she had noticed in the riders on the road, purposeful without performance. Kael dismounted and handed his horse off, without ceremony, and looked at Celine as she dismounted. "Rooms will be prepared," he said. "You'll have access to the east wing, not the north." "What's in the north?" "Things that aren't yours yet." She looked at him. "You said yet." He looked back with an expression that gave her nothing, and was aware it was giving her nothing. A woman appeared from the main entrance, older, gray-braided, with the specific authority of someone who ran an institution rather than served in one. She looked at Celine with the flat assessment of a person who was not going to pretend she hadn't already formed several opinions. "This is Hesta," Kael said. "She runs the house." "I've run it longer than he's been king," Hesta said to Celine, without particular pride, just as fact. "You'll eat before you're settled. You look like you've been traveling on nerve alone for 12 hours and that runs out." Celine almost said she was fine. Then she registered that she was, in fact, running on nerve alone, and that nerve had a shelf life, and this woman had correctly identified it, and lying about it would have been both unnecessary and revealing in the wrong ways. "Thank you," she said. Hesta nodded once and turned back to the entrance with the movement of a woman who had never needed to wait for agreement. Celine followed her in, and as she crossed the threshold of the fortress, she felt the weight of the last 24 hours settle into her body with the specific gravity of things that have been held at a distance by emergency and arrive all at once when the emergency passes. Her legs were steady, her hands were steady, but something behind her sternum was doing something complicated, the way a structure does something complicated when the pressure on it suddenly changes. She kept walking. She did not let it show. They gave her a room that was plain and high-ceilinged and cold, in the way northern rooms are cold. Not damp, not neglected, just built in a place where warmth was earned rather than assumed. There was a fire laid, and Hesta lit it without asking and left without ceremony, and Celine stood in front of it and held her hands toward the heat and breathed. Brant. She needed to know about Brant. She needed to know what Darius would do in the hours after she left. Whether he would shore up the sentence and declare her an imperial fugitive, or whether the public nature of what had just happened would give him pause. She needed to know whether Verena would accelerate whatever came next, or whether Kael's intervention had bought enough disruption to slow her. She needed to know what Morel knew. That was the key she kept returning to. Morella was the instrument, but instruments remembered the hands that used them, and if Morel survived whatever she had been given, she was either Verena's most protected asset or her most dangerous liability. A knock at the door. "Come." It was not Hesta. It was one of Kael's men, young, economical, with the careful bearing of someone used to carrying information in environments where information had value. "The king requests you in the study," he said. "When you're ready." "When you're ready. Not now. Not immediately." She noted the language. 10 minutes, she said. He nodded and was gone. She took the 10 minutes. She washed her face in the cold basin water and felt it pull her back into her body with a sharpness that was useful. She looked at herself in the small metal mirror on the wall, not at the state of her appearance, which was what the mirror was presumably for, but at the face itself, the face she had been wearing for 25 years through a childhood that had been managed rather than lived, a marriage that had been political architecture rather than any kind of life, and an execution that had failed to happen. She looked at the face and thought, "You are still here." Then she went to find Kael's study. It was in the east wing, at the end of a corridor lined with maps, actual maps, the kind that had been drawn and corrected and drawn again over years, with annotations in at least 3 different hands. She looked at them as she walked and registered. Northern territories, border routes, trade corridors, the topography of the mountain passes that separated Kael's land from the Vane Empire. Someone had been tracking movement through those passes for a long time. The notations were dense and recent. The study itself was a working room rather than a display room. No performance of wealth, no furniture designed to communicate importance. A large table covered in documents, shelves of actual reference materials used, 2 chairs that were functional rather than decorative. Kael stood at the table with his back to the door when she entered, reading something, and he did not immediately turn. She came to the table and waited. She was not going to announce herself. He turned after a moment and set down what he was reading and looked at her with the gray eyes that she was finding increasingly difficult to read with any confidence, which was an unusual experience. "Verena made a move this afternoon," he said. Celine felt the small cold drop of that in her chest. "What kind?" "She sent a rider to the Eastern Lords." He picked up a document from the table, a transcription she could see, in the notation style of a man who received verbal reports and had them written. Officially, to inform them of the events of this morning. Unofficially, to begin framing what happened as an act of northern aggression against imperial sovereignty. "She's moving faster than I thought. She'd been ready for this." He looked at her steadily. The move this morning wasn't just about removing you. It was the opening of something. Your execution was supposed to be the first public crack in Darius's legitimacy, a king who condemns his queen on a manufactured evidence, with Verena positioned to step into the chaos that follows. And instead, Darius looks weak for a different reason, Selene said. A northern king rode into his capital and walked out with his queen. Yes, which Verena can use. Which Verena is already using. He set the document down. She doesn't care what the story is as long as the story serves her direction. Darius looks weak regardless of which version people believe. Either he condemned an innocent woman or he couldn't hold her. Either way, she's the stable hand in the room. He paused. She's been building toward a regency claim. Selene looked at him. She has no blood right. She doesn't need blood right if she has enough of the council, and the court convinced that the empire needs a steady hand while the king is distracted by a crisis she manufactured. His eyes held hers. She's going to move against Darius. She's going to use what happened this morning to make the case that his judgment is compromised. And she's going to do it before he can stabilize. The fire in the corner of the room made a sound. Outside, the wind had picked up against the fortress walls. Selene stood at the table in the northern fortress of a man she had met 12 hours ago and felt the shape of what Verena had built moving into full visibility for the first time. The whole architecture of it. The years of patient work, and she felt the specific cold anger of a woman who has spent 6 years surviving something that was never actually about her survival. It was about what she represented, what she stood in the way of, what she would have become had she ever understood what she was standing in the middle of. She's going to burn the empire down to own the ashes, Selene said. Yes, Kael said, and we are the only people currently positioned to stop her. She looked at him, at the scar, at the gray eyes that were not calculating her as an asset right now, but were doing something else, something she did not yet have a name for. We, she said. You know the interior. I have the exterior position. He held her gaze with the directness she was coming to understand was simply how he operated. No performance, no softening, no management. Together, we have something she doesn't know we have. Which is time, he said. She thinks you're running. She doesn't know you've stopped. Outside the study, one of the guards was moving down the corridor with a pace that was too quick and too quiet, the specific movement of a man carrying urgent news. Before he knocked, before the door opened, Selene already felt it. And when the door opened and the young guard stepped in with a face that had gone past, controlled into the territory where control means something is very wrong, she was already looking at Kael. Rider from the capital, the guard said. He was breathing slightly too fast. The king's seal. Kael took the message, read it. His face did not change, but something in the room did. The quality of attention he was giving the paper. The stillness that was not his usual stillness, but a different kind. The kind that comes before a decision. He set the message on the table and turned it so she could read it. Darius had not issued a fugitive declaration. He had done something Selene had not anticipated. Something that told her the crack she had seen in him was deeper than she had assessed. Something that told her Verena had not fully controlled the man she had been using. Darius had requested a formal summit, not with Kael, with her. And the message carried a second line, in Darius's own hand rather than the scribe's. She recognized the pressure of it, the particular angle of his letters, from 6 years of state documents that had passed through her hands. The witnesses have recanted. All 6. Selene read it twice. The fire crackled. The wind moved against stone, and she understood, in the space of a breath, that the board had not simply shifted. It had been flipped, and every piece was in the air. 6 witnesses. Selene read the message a third time, not because the words changed, because she needed to feel the weight of them settling into the architecture of everything she had already built in her mind, needed to find where they fit and what they displaced, and what new shape the whole thing took when they were in it. 6 witnesses had sworn, before the royal council, before Darius himself, that they had seen her handle the wine that reached Morel. 6 witnesses had given names and positions and specific details, the kind of specific details that take preparation to produce, that do not emerge organically from a lie, but require construction, rehearsal, the patient assembly of a story that can survive cross-examination. Verena had built those witnesses the way she built everything, carefully, over time, with the understanding that the construction would need to hold weight. And now they had recanted, all six, before sunrise. The speed of it was the thing that would not settle. A recantation was not a simple thing. It required the witness to reverse a sworn statement before the same authority that had recorded it, to accept the consequences of having lied to a royal council, which were not minor consequences. You did not recant 6 coordinated false testimonies in the space of a few hours. Unless something had happened that made the cost of recanting lower than the cost of holding. Something had changed in the capital in the hours after Kael wrote her out. Celine looked at Kael across the table. He was watching her read, watching her work through it, and he was doing the particular thing she had noticed him do twice now, giving her the space to process without filling it, without managing her toward a conclusion. It was not a common quality in men who held significant power. Most of them could not tolerate the silence of another person thinking. "Who got to them?" she said. "I don't know yet." "But you have a theory." He was quiet for a moment. "Brant," he said. She felt the name land in her chest. Brant, who had pressed his fist to his chest in the old gesture. Brant, who had 32 years in that court and knew where every pressure point was. Brant, who she had told to find the crack and push. She had not told him to do it fast enough to produce 6 recantations before sunrise. But Brant had always operated on his own timeline when the situation required it. "If it was Brant," she said carefully, "then he exposed himself." "Yes." "Verena will know." "Yes." She set the message down on the table and looked at the wall for a moment, at nothing in particular, feeling the specific weight of a choice she had made from a locked room in the dark that had produced a consequence she could not control from 4 hours north. Brant had served 32 years without once being the kind of person Verena needed to destroy. He had survived that court by being useful and quiet, and never once giving anyone a reason to look at him directly. She had given Verena a reason. "Darius's summit request," she said. She pulled herself back to the immediate architecture. Grief was a thing to carry. It was not a thing to stop for. "What do you read in it?" Kael picked up the message. "Read it again, briefly." "He's panicking. The recantations cracked his counsel's confidence in the verdict, and he needs to resolve it before Verena can reframe the narrative in the direction she's moving. He also needs me back in the Empire," Celine said. "As long as I'm here, his authority is incomplete. He condemned his queen on false evidence, and a northern king walked her out of his execution square. That story is already moving through the eastern territories. The summit is an attempt to close it. What he wants and what's good for him are the same thing for once," Kael said, "which makes him more dangerous, not less. Desperate men with legitimate grievances make decisions at a speed that outpaces their judgment." Darius's judgment was never the problem. She heard the flatness in her own voice. His judgment was functional. It was his priorities that were wrong. Kael looked at her with an expression she did not try to interpret. He had a way of listening that was total, the way a man listens when he is not simultaneously preparing his response, and she was still adjusting to it. 6 years of a husband who heard sounds rather than words had left her with certain calibrations that did not fit this room. "We go," she said. "To the summit." "Yes." "On his terms." "No." She looked at Kael steadily. "On terms we set. Neutral ground, which means neither the capital nor here. A midpoint location with your riders present and visible. And Verena is not in the room." Kael considered this for a moment. "He may refuse the conditions. Then we learn something useful about what the summit is actually for." He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "We leave at first light." They camped at the midpoint the following evening, a way station town called Dreth that sat at the border of the Vane Empire's northern edge, the kind of place that had survived generations by being too small to matter and too useful to ruin. 2 inns, a mill, a market square that served the surrounding farmland. Kael's men took up positions in and around the primary inn with the quiet efficiency she had come to recognize as their standard operating mode. Darius arrived 4 hours after they did. He came with 20 riders and Vorant and 2 council lords she did not recognize from the secondary tables, which told her he was keeping this close. Not a public summit, but a contained one, the kind that left less record. He did not bring Verena. She watched his party arrive from the window of the room Kael had placed her in. 2nd floor, eastern facing, with a view of the approach road. Darius rode at the front, and she watched him dismount, and she watched the way he moved, and she read in it something she had not expected and did not yet have a name for. He looked tired. Not the performed exhaustion of a man seeking sympathy, but the specific tiredness of a man who had not slept and whose body was carrying something heavy that had nothing to do with the ride. She let Kyle go down first. She waited 10 minutes, which was long enough to signal that she was not in a hurry and short enough to avoid appearing to make a point of it. Then she came down and walked into the common room of the inn, where Darius and Kyle were standing at opposite ends of a table that two of Kyle's men had cleared of everything except a lamp. Darius looked at her when she entered, and the thing that moved across his face was fast and complicated, and she filed it without analysis for later. "Celine," he said. "Darius." She sat. Kyle sat. After a moment, Darius sat. "The witnesses have recanted," Darius said. He said it to her directly, not to Kyle. All 6 submitted revised statements to the council. They admitted to false testimony under pressure from an unnamed third party. "Unnamed," she said. "They name no one specifically." His jaw moved. "But the council has opened an inquiry. The direction of the evidence is—" He stopped. "Verena is being questioned." Celine held very still. "Is she?" "The inquiry began this morning." He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "I need to know what you know. What you've known. How long you've been tracking what she was building." "You need to answer a question first," she said. He waited. "The crack," she said. "I saw it in you in the execution square. You were not certain. You signed it anyway. I need to know whether that was calculation or cowardice, because what I tell you and how much I tell you depends on which one it was." The room went very quiet. Vorant, standing at the wall, made a small sound that was suppressed immediately. Kyle, beside her, was entirely still. Darius looked at her for a long time. The lamplight was doing something to his face that made him look older than he was, or perhaps it was the honest version of his age rather than the curated one. When he spoke, his voice was low and did not perform anything. "Both," he said. "It was both." She breathed. "Both is an answer I can work with," she said. "Cowardice I can account for. Calculation I can account for. The combination tells me where your loyalties actually sit." She leaned forward slightly. "You signed it because the public structure required it, not because you believed it, and that means some part of you has been watching Verena for longer than you've admitted, even to yourself." His jaw was tight. "I have a counsel that is 70% her placement. I have a high marshal who reports to her before he reports to me. I have had a mistress who was—" He stopped. "Morel is alive," Celine said. It was not a question. "She is. She's recovering." He looked at the table. "The physicians believe the dose was calculated to incapacitate, not kill. Someone wanted her unconscious, not dead." Celine processed this against what she had already built. Verena would not kill a piece she still needed. Morel unconscious produced the accusation. Morel dead produced an investigation that might go in directions Verena could not control. The calculation was precise, and it was cold, and it was exactly the kind of move that required years of practice with the specific mechanics of using people as instruments. "What has Morel told the inquiry?" Kyle said. It was the first thing he had said since Darius arrived, and it landed with the flat weight of someone who had been waiting for the right question. Darius looked at him. It was the look of a king assessing another king, the specific mutual appraisal of men who held different territories and were deciding what each other was worth. "Nothing yet. She has declined to speak until she has conditions." "What conditions?" Celine said. "Safety guarantees written, countersigned by someone she trusts outside the Empire." He let that land. Celine looked at Kyle. Kyle looked at Celine. And in the space of that exchange, something was decided that had not existed as a possibility 12 hours ago. A shift in the structural arrangement of the situation that she felt in her chest, like the ground changing grade beneath her feet. "I'll countersign," Kyle said. He said it to Darius, but his eyes stayed on Celine for one additional second before they moved. "Get Morel's conditions in writing. I'll have my own terms attached." Darius looked at both of them with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite relief, but held both. "This is a formal treaty negotiation," he said slowly. You understand what you're beginning. I understand what you're ending, Kael said. There's a difference. Bon. The ambush came at the second hour past midnight. Celine was awake when it started. She had not slept because sleep had not been available to her, because the mind she had spent years sharpening did not know how to stand down when the variables were still moving. She was sitting at the window of her room listening to the town's nighttime sounds when the sounds changed. Not dramatically, not with the obvious announcement of violence, but with the small wrongness of sounds that belonged somewhere else, arriving somewhere they shouldn't. A horse where there should be no horse. A footstep with the specific cadence of someone trained to move quietly, which is subtly different from the natural quiet of a person moving at night and immediately recognizable to someone who has learned the difference. She was at the door when the first shout came from the courtyard. The corridor was dark. She moved along it with her hand on the wall and the copper bracelet cold against her wrist, and every sense she had pulled to its outer edge, reading the dark the way she had learned to read rooms. A door at the far end opened and lamplight spilled out, and two of Kael's men came through it at a run. "North wall," one of them said when he saw her. Not to her. Past her, to someone behind her. She turned. Kael was 3 feet behind her. He had not been there a second ago. He had a blade she had not seen him carry, and he was already moving toward the stairwell with the focused economy of a man whose body had a separate intelligence for this particular situation. "Stay in the room," he said without stopping. "No," she said, and followed him. He didn't argue. There was not time for it, and she thought he understood, somewhere in the rapid calculation he was running, that she was not going to be useful locked in a room, and he had already said she was useful. The courtyard was worse than the sounds had suggested. 8, maybe 10 men in the dark clothing of no particular affiliation, not Empire colors, not Northern colors, the deliberate non-uniform of hired work. They had come in from the north wall, and 3 of Kael's men were already engaged. One of Darius's riders was down in the entrance of the stable. Vorant was nowhere visible. Kael moved into it without hesitation, and she watched, in the compressed time of extreme attention, a man operate in violence with the same quality he operated in everything else. No performance, no excess, just the functional application of a body that had been built for this and used for this, and had resolved all its questions about it long ago. She moved to the east wall, away from the fighting, keeping the stone at her back and watching the perimeter, because the perimeter was where the second wave would come if there was one. There was one. 2 men came over the east wall at the far end, and she saw them before they cleared it, and she did the calculation in the 3 seconds available to her. Kael was occupied at the north. His men were occupied at the north. The east was her or no one. She had no weapon. She had the wall at her back, and the dark, and the fact that they had not yet seen her. She did not run. Running created sound and silhouette. She moved laterally along the wall, slow and low, into the deep shadow between the stable entrance and the storage outbuilding, and she held there while the 2 men came down from the wall and moved toward the main inn, and she could see in the way they moved that they were not here for the general engagement. They were here for a specific target. They were moving toward the room Darius had been given. She felt it land in her stomach like cold stone. Darius. This was not an attempt to disrupt the summit. This was an attempt to close it permanently, to remove the one piece that Verena could not control now that the witnesses had recanted. The king himself, who was an hour away from countersigning a treaty that would bring Kael's force to bear on an inquiry that was already pointing in her direction. She came out of the shadow. She did not have a weapon, and she had never been trained as a fighter because queens were not trained as fighters. Queens were trained to stand still and look legitimate while the men around them made the decisions that mattered. But she had spent 6 years in a court that ran on the management of information and attention, and she understood that what she needed to do was not fight these 2 men, but make enough noise in the right direction to pull Kael or one of his riders to the east side before the 2 men reached Darius's door. She picked up the iron water bucket from beside the stable entrance, and she threw it against the stone wall of the outbuilding with the full force of her arms, and the sound it made in the night was enormous. Both men turned. She was already moving, not toward them, laterally again, using the noise as cover for position, keeping the dark between them and her. She heard running from the north end of the courtyard, one of Kael's men. Then Kael's voice, sharp and directing. The 2 men by the east wall made the calculation quickly, and it was the wrong one. They ran for the inn entrance rather than retreating back over the wall. The first one hit the doorway, and the second one was 3 steps behind when Kyle came around the south corner of the stable, and the engagement was over in under 30 seconds. In a way she did not fully track because she was watching the courtyard perimeter for a third wave, and there was none. Silence returned to Dreth with the particular completeness of silence after violence. Kyle came to where she was standing by the stable entrance. He was breathing harder than his default, and there was blood on his forearm that she could see even in the dark, a dark stain on darker fabric. "You threw a bucket," he said. "I didn't have a blade." He looked at her for a long moment in the dark. Then he looked at the inn, where lamplight was now appearing in several windows, and at the east wall, and at the 2 men his riders were securing in the courtyard. "Verena's work," she said. "Yes." He looked at the blood on his arm with the disinterest of someone noting a minor inconvenience. "She knows about the summit. She knows about the recantations. She moved faster than I estimated." She always moves faster than people estimate. Celine felt the cold fully for the first time, the night air against her skin, the adrenaline beginning its retreat from her body and leaving something raw and exposed in its wake. That's been the core of everyone's mistake with her, including mine. Darius appeared in the doorway of the inn. He was dressed and armed, which told her he had not been asleep either, which told her he had known the summit was dangerous and had come anyway, which was either courage or desperation, and she was not yet certain which. He looked at the courtyard, at the secured men, at Celine and Kyle standing by the stable. "They came for me," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Kyle said. Darius looked at his own hands for a moment, and she watched him experience the thing that men who have always held power experience when they understand, for the first time in a physical and immediate way, that the power they held did not protect them from the people closest to them. It was a particular kind of collapse, not dramatic, not loud, but structural, the way a wall fails not at the moment of impact, but at the moment the material understands it has been undermined at the base. "She was going to let you sign the treaty," Celine said. "Not cruel, just clear. She was going to let the summit happen and then remove you before it could be acted on. You were always part of the end sequence, Darius. You were never the one giving the orders. You were the last door she needed to close." He said nothing. "The inquiry into the false witnesses," she continued. "Who authorized it?" "I did." "And who executed the authorization? Who physically gave the order to the council investigators?" He looked at her. "Vorant," she said. The name moved through him visibly. She watched it. Vorant, who was Darius's man from the bone out. That was what she had believed. That was what everyone had believed. Because Vorant had been with Darius for 11 years and had been built into the architecture of the kingdom so completely that his loyalty was treated as structural, as load-bearing, as a thing you did not check because checking it would mean imagining it could fail. Vorant was not in the courtyard. He had not appeared during the attack. Kyle's head came up. He had arrived at the same place she had, 1 second behind. He turned and looked at his nearest rider. "Find Vorant," he said. "Now!" The rider ran. Celine looked at Darius, who was standing in the doorway of the inn in the cold dark, understanding something about the man he had trusted most and the woman he had condemned and the 11 years of architecture that had just revealed itself as something else entirely. She had no comfort to offer him. She had none left for situations that did not require it. What she had was the same thing she had always had. The cold, clear, forward-facing attention of a woman who had survived by never confusing what she wished were true with what was. Vorant had authorized the inquiry. Vorant had sent the investigators in a direction that Verena would have been watching, and when the summit was arranged, Vorant had known the location, the timing, the protection detail. He had not appeared during the attack because he had not needed to. The rider returned in 4 minutes. She knew what he was going to say before he said it. "Vorant's horse is gone," he said. "He rode out the south gate 2 hours ago. The night held what it held. The courtyard held its dead and its secured men and its silence." Kyle stood still in that particular way he stood still when he was making a decision from a position of absolute certainty, and Celine stood beside him and felt the full scope of what they were now standing inside of. Verena had not simply built an architecture around removing Celine. She had built it around removing everyone. She had placed her pieces at the center of the king's confidence, at the mechanism of his authority, at the instrument that was supposed to investigate her. She had built a trap that used Darius's own hands to spring it, and she had built it so thoroughly that even a man trying to reverse course could not reach out to stabilize himself without grabbing the thing that would bring him down. Celine turned to Darius and she said the thing that was true, that had been true, that she had understood from the moment Kael's message arrived and that she had been moving toward since before she knew it. "You cannot go back to that capital," she said. "Not until this is finished. Not until we finish it." Darius looked at her with everything that had ever been complicated between them, stripped away by the violence of the night and the cold and the particular clarity that comes when the options collapse to their essential number. "And if I disagree," he said, "then you ride back and you walk into whatever Verena has prepared for you, and she finishes what she started tonight with better planning and no witnesses." She held his gaze. "Or you stay, and we do this together, the three of us, and we end it." The choice was not a choice. That was the thing about corners. They did not offer options. They offered the thing you were going to do, and the illusion that you had chosen it. Darius looked at Kael. Kael looked back at him without moving. "Together," Darius said. It was not agreement exactly. It was the sound of a man who had run out of alternatives and had arrived, finally and entirely too late, at the only door that was still open. And behind them, in the dark, Verena's two hired men sat bound in the courtyard dirt, and somewhere on a road south, a man named Vorant was riding toward a woman who was burning the empire she had spent years building, because burning it was the only way to own what was left. They rode south before dawn, not back to the capital, not yet, not directly, but toward it, on the back roads that Kael's riders knew and the empire's patrols did not use. The kind of roads that existed because people had been moving through difficult country for generations, and had learned that the official routes were built for visibility and the real routes were built for survival. Celine rode in the center of the formation again, but it was a different center than 2 days ago. 2 days ago, she had been a piece being moved. Now she was something that did not yet have a name, but was heavier and sharper and moved with its own direction. Darius rode on her left. He had not slept. She could see it in the set of his jaw and the specific quality of his silence. The silence of a man whose mind had not stopped running since the courtyard of Dreth. She had spent 6 years reading that face, and she had never seen it look like this. Not broken, that was the wrong word, but stripped of the architecture it had always used to present itself. What was left was rawer and smaller and more honestly human than anything she had seen from him in years. She did not know what to do with that. She filed it. Kael rode on her right, and Kael looked the same as he always looked, which she was coming to understand was not the same as him feeling nothing. It was the same as him having resolved, somewhere along the road of his particular life, that what he felt was information to be used rather than weather to be survived. The cut on his forearm had been bound with clean linen by one of his men before they rode. He had not mentioned it again. They were 3 hours south when the rider came toward them from the capital road. He was one of Kael's. She recognized the black without insignia, and he was riding hard, the specific hard of urgency rather than schedule. Kael pulled up, and the rider pulled up, and they spoke in low voices that she could hear clearly because she had positioned herself to hear clearly. "Verena moved," the rider said. His horse was breathing in hard pulls. "Last night, she called an emergency session of what's left of the council. Darius's loyalists have been removed from the chamber, 3 of them by force. She has a motion on the table declaring the king incapacitated pending inquiry." Kael was still. On what grounds? His departure from the capital. His meeting with a foreign ruler without council authorization. His association with the deposed queen. The writer said it clean without editorializing. "The motion has the votes. It passes the moment she calls the formal count." "How long?" "She's called the count for midday." Celine looked at the sky. The light was the flat gray of early morning, the sun still below the horizon, but the dark fully gone. Midday was 6 hours. "Vorant," she said. The rider looked at her. "He arrived at the capital at first light. He went directly to the council chamber." She turned to look at Kael. He was already looking at her. 6 hours. The distance to the capital was manageable in 6 hours if they pushed, if they did not stop, if the road held. If they arrived at the capital with Darius present and breathing and capable of standing in front of a council chamber and occupying the space of a king who had not been incapacitated, the motion failed. A regency declaration required the subject of the declaration to be absent or unable to contest it. That was the mechanism. That was the gap. Verena had built the timing to close that gap. "She doesn't know we're already moving," Darius said. He had heard all of it. His voice was flat and operational. "She thinks we're still at Dreth." "She'll know within the hour," Kael said. "Varant will have estimated our position when he left." "Then we have the hour," Celine said, "and we use it." They hit the capital's outer road at the third hour, and Kael sent riders ahead at that point, not to announce, but to position. She watched him give the orders in pieces, efficient and specific, and she watched his men receive and execute without the administrative overhead of men who needed reassurance. The formation changed as they rode, spread wider, the gaps between riders tightening toward the capital's edge, the collective posture shifting from transit to approach. Celine felt her heartbeat change. Not accelerate exactly, shift, the way a river shifts when the grade beneath it steepens. The same volume of water moving faster because the ground has changed. She had lived in that capital for 6 years. She knew its streets and its gates and its political geography with the intimacy of someone who had spent years mapping a territory she was not supposed to understand. She knew which gates had which guards, and which guards had which loyalties, and which corridors led where without passing the open spaces that the council chamber's windows faced. She knew where Verena would be. "The council chamber is in the east wing," she said to Kael. "The formal entrance is the main corridor, which is visible from the guard tower at the north wall. The secondary entrance comes through the records archive on the south side. It's used for document transit. It has 2 guards rather than 8, and neither of them is a Vorant appointment because it's not considered a significant access point." Kael looked at her. "You've been thinking about how to move through that building since before we left Dreth." "I've been thinking about how to move through that building for 3 years," she said. "I just had different purposes in mind." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not the almost smile she had seen before. This was closer to the actual article. "South corridor," he said. "You lead. Each." The capital received them the way cities receive things that arrive fast and purposeful, and before anyone has prepared a response, with a kind of stunned clearing, the street population moving to the edges not from ceremony, but from the instinct of people who have learned that fast horses and hard faces means stand aside. Kael's formation came through the main gate on Darius's authority. His seal, presented by a rider who had been sent ahead, still carried enough force that the gate commander made the calculation quickly and opened rather than escalate. They left the horses in the outer yard. Celine moved at the front with Kael and 2 of his riders, and Darius behind them, and she moved through the capital corridors she had walked for 6 years with a quality of motion she had not used before. Not the managed, careful step of a queen performing presence, but something lower and faster and stripped of all its presentation. The copper bracelet was cold against her wrist. She did not think about what they were moving toward. She thought about the next door and the one after that. The records archive was unlocked. The 2 guards at the secondary entrance looked at the 4 of them and made the correct assessment and stepped aside. She heard the council chamber before she reached it. The sound was the particular sound of a formal proceeding in a room that was not entirely calm. Voices at the controlled volume of official procedure, underneath which was the current of something that wanted to be louder. She recognized Verena's voice. It was doing what Verena's voice always did, carrying through a space without raising itself, the specific projection of a woman who had learned to let rooms come to her rather than reaching for them. Kael's hand came to her arm, light, not stopping her, checking position. She looked at him. He nodded once. She opened the door. The council chamber was a long room with a vaulted ceiling and high windows and a central table around which 14 men sat, or had sat before the door opened, and the room registered what had come through it. Verena stood at the head of the table in the position that was not formally the king's position, but was close enough to communicate intent. Varant was at the right wall. 3 men she recognized as Verena's deepest placements were between her and the table. The rest of the council, Darius's remaining loyalists, the secondary appointments, the men who had survived Verena's quiet cull because they were useful rather than aligned, were arranged in the uncertain posture of people who had been watching a proceeding and were not certain whose side they were on until they were certain who was going to win. Verena looked at the door. She looked at Celine. She looked at Kyle. She looked at Darius, who came through the door last and stood inside the chamber in his own council room in his own capital, and said nothing. Just stood there and occupied the space of a man who had not been incapacitated and was not going to be. The room was completely silent. Celine watched Verena's face, watched it do the thing she had only seen it do twice before in her life: recalibrate. Not in panic, not in fear, but in the cold, rapid way of a mind that has encountered an obstacle and is already mapping around it. The satisfaction was gone from her face. What replaced it was something cleaner and more honest and in some ways more frightening: pure operational assessment. "The king," Verena said. Her voice was exactly level. "Has returned without notification to the council." "The king," Darius said, "returns to his own chamber without requiring council notification." He walked to the head of the table, to the chair that was his, and he did not look at Verena as he passed her. He sat. "The emergency session is adjourned." "The session was called under Article 9, Vorant said from the right wall. He said it with the voice of a man who had decided which side of the room he was on and was committed to it. "It cannot be adjourned by the subject of the motion while the motion is active." "Vorant." Kael said the name once, without volume, without heat. He looked at the man across the chamber with the gray eyes and the scarred jaw, and the total absence of anything that needed to perform itself. "Sit down." Vorant looked at him. The calculation was visible, a man assessing whether the source of an instruction had the force to back it. Whatever he found in Kael's face settled the calculation quickly. He sat. "The witnesses who provided false testimony to this council have recanted," Celine said. She walked to the center of the room, and she did not go to the table. She stood in the open floor where everyone could see her, and she spoke to the full chamber, not to Verena, not to any individual. "They have submitted revised statements under their own names admitting to false testimony under pressure. Copies of those statements are in the possession of King Kael Draven as a neutral holding party." She paused. "The council member who coordinated the false testimony is in this room." The chamber moved. It was not dramatic. No one stood. No one shouted. It was the small distributed movement of men who are recalibrating their positions, the physical language of people deciding which direction is safe to face. Verena said, "These are serious allegations from a woman who was under sentence 2 days ago." "The sentence was based on false testimony," Celine said. "You know that. Every person in this room who has been watching you work for the last 4 years knows that. The question is not what happened. The question is what happens next, and that depends on who in this room is still calculating their personal position against your continued influence." She looked at the council, one by one. Not accusation, assessment, letting each of them feel the specific discomfort of being seen rather than assumed. Two of the men she identified as Verena's secondary placements looked at the table. That told her enough. Verena said, "Lord Kael has no standing in an imperial council proceeding. He has standing as a countersigning party to the testimony agreement with Morel of the Vane Court," Celine said, "who has agreed to provide full account of the events of the banquet, the arrangement of the false witnesses, and the origin of the substance used in the poisoning, in exchange for safety guarantees, which are now in effect." She looked at Verena for the first time directly. "Morel is going to tell this council everything." Verena held her gaze, the pewter flat eyes, the still hands, the face that had never once in 61 years shown her what was happening behind it. "You were always the most dangerous thing in this marriage," Verena said. It was not quite a compliment and not quite a concession. It was the kind of thing said by someone who has run out of moves and is choosing how to stand in the absence of them. "Darius never saw it. I saw it from the first year." "I know," Celine said. "That's why you moved when you did." "If I'd moved earlier..." "You would have failed earlier," Celine said. "You needed me to be invisible long enough to clear the board. The moment I stopped being invisible was the moment it unraveled." She paused. "You built it on the assumption that I would keep surviving quietly. That was the flaw." Something shifted in Verena's face, very small. The kind of shift that only happened when someone acknowledged, in the deepest chamber of themselves, that they had been outthought. Then Vorant stood up. He did not reach for a blade. He was smarter than that, surrounded by Kael's men. He stood, and he said, in the voice of a man who had made his calculation and was executing it, The motion stands. Article 9 requires Kael cross the room in 4 strides, and Vorant stopped talking because Kael's hand was around his collar and Vorant's back was against the wall, and the physical reality of the situation had superseded the procedural one. Kael did not hit him. He held him against the wall with the total stillness of a man who did not need to demonstrate force because the force was self-evident. Article 9, Kael said quietly, requires a quorum. Count your quorum, Vorant. Vorant looked at the table. Kael released him, stepped back, and Vorant looked at the 14 seats and counted the men in them, and arrived at the number that told him the quorum that Verena had assembled with such careful architecture had dissolved in the time it took for 2 council members to stop meeting his eyes. The motion was dead. Verena looked at Celine. "Arrest her," Darius said. His voice was flat and final, and had in it the specific register of a man who had stopped calculating and was simply executing what was true. "Her and Voran. Hold them for the formal inquiry." The guards at the chamber door moved. Verena did not run. She was 61 years old, and she did not run, and she would not have run even if running were possible, because Verena had spent 40 years being the kind of woman who did not give any room the satisfaction of seeing her break from still. She held her posture as the guards came to her, and she held her chin level, and she looked at Celine with the pewter eyes until the guards turned her toward the door. Celine watched her go. She felt not victory, not yet, and possibly not that exactly, because victory implied a clean end, and this was not a clean end. There were still the Eastern lords that Verena had contacted. There was still the political infrastructure she had spent years building, which did not evaporate because its architect had been taken from the room. There were still the pieces on the board that did not know the game had changed. She felt the weight of what had been done and the larger weight of what was still ahead, and she felt the copper bracelet on her wrist and her own heartbeat, which was not settled, which was still running at the pace of a body that knew the ground was not stable yet. Darius was looking at her from his chair at the head of the table. She looked back at him. "It's not finished," she said. "I know." The Eastern Lords received her framing before any of this happened. They are positioned right now on the basis of information that told them Kael took aggressive action against the Empire and the king's authority was compromised. She held his gaze. They are going to mobilize on that framing unless something reaches them first. Darius was quiet for a moment. "How much time?" "A day, maybe less. We need to send riders." "Riders aren't enough," she said. "They need a demonstration. They need to see that this court is not fractured and the king is not weak, and the story Verena sent them is not the true version of what happened." She paused. "They need to see all 3 of us. Together. In person, on the Eastern Road, before they have time to commit to a formation." Darius looked at Kael. Kael was looking at the map on the chamber wall. A large installation, the full imperial territory with its eastern reaches and the roads between the capital and the Lord holdings. He was reading it the way he read everything, not for confirmation of what he expected to find, but for what was actually there. "The Brennan Pass," Kael said without turning. "It's the only eastbound route that covers 3 of the 4 major Lord territories in a single approach. If we hold position there, they come to us." He turned. "It's also defensible, which matters if any of them have already committed past the point of communication." "Committed means armed," Celine said. "Yes." She breathed, felt the room, felt the weight of the 3 of them in it together, the improbable alignment of a king and a queen and a northern ruler standing inside a problem that none of them could solve from their individual positions, but that the 3 of them together might hold. "Brennan Pass," Darius said. "When?" "Now," Kael said. "We ride within the hour." Darius stood. He looked at Celine, and in his face was the arrangement of a man who had burned through everything he thought he was, and was standing in what was left, which was more than she had expected and less than it should have been, and the particular complicated human thing that it actually was. "I need to say something," he said. "Later," she said. "Not dismissal, just accuracy. Say it when we're through the pass and the east is settled and there's time for it to mean something." She turned toward the door. "Right now I need you to be a king." She walked out of the council chamber and into the corridor and heard Kael fall into step beside her and felt, rather than heard, Darius follow. They were halfway to the outer yard, to the horses, to the eastern road, and everything waiting on it, when the sound reached them from the direction of the holding cells. Not a shout, Not an alarm, but the specific contained sound of controlled emergency. The kind of sound that happens when something goes wrong that someone was trying to prevent. Cale stopped. She stopped. One of his riders appeared at the corridor's far end at a full run, and the expression on his face was the one she had come to recognize as the precursor to information she did not want. "Verena," the rider said, breathing hard. "She had a blade on her, in her sleeve. She got to Vorant before they were separated." Celine felt the cold drop of it. "Vorant is dead." "No." The rider looked at both of them and then past them, at Darius. "Vorant got it away from her. She—" He stopped, started again. "She turned it." The corridor held its breath. "She's still alive," the rider said, "but she's asking for the queen. Only the queen. She says she'll talk, but she'll only talk to you." He looked at Celine. "She says she has names, the Eastern lords who were already committed before she sent the framing, the ones who aren't waiting for a signal because they already have their orders." His voice was flat and careful with the information. "She says without those names, the pass won't be enough." Celine stood in the corridor between a man who had nearly executed her and a man who had pulled her from the execution. And behind the rider, 2 guards were waiting, and in a holding cell 30 feet away, a 61-year-old woman was still playing the game with the last instrument she had left. Kael looked at Celine. She looked back at him, and the choice was not a choice. It was the shape of the thing she had already become in the space of the last 3 days, the version of herself that did not exist before the execution square, that could not have existed before it, that had only become possible in the specific crucible of nearly dying and not dying and understanding, in the cold and irreversible way of a woman who had stopped surviving and started deciding that whatever she walked into next, she walked into it on her own terms. She turned toward those holding cells. "Don't come in," she said, to both of them. "She'll close the moment anyone else enters." "Celine," Kael said, "I know what I'm doing." She looked at him, and the look was steady and clear and held everything she had left. "I've been in rooms with her my whole life. This is the last one." She walked down the corridor. Behind her, the footsteps of both men stopped at the boundary she had drawn. And ahead, the door to the holding cell stood between her and the final account of a woman who had spent 40 years being the most dangerous thing in every room she entered, waiting for the one person she had always known was the only one worth speaking to. Celine put her hand on the door, pushed it open, and walked in. The cell was small and cold and smelled like stone and old iron, the smell of a room that had held many people's worst days without absorbing any of the lessons. Verena sat on the bench along the far wall with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her chin level, and the only indication that anything had changed was the linen wrapped around her left palm where the blade had turned. The linen was dark at the center. She had not asked for better treatment, and she would not. That was consistent. That was, Celine thought as she closed the door behind her and let her eyes adjust to the low light, perhaps the most honest thing about the woman. She did not perform weakness any more than she performed warmth. What she was completely. Celine stood, did not sit. She wanted the standing. Verena looked at her with the pewter eyes and the expression that had never once in 25 years told Celine what was behind it, and for the first time in 25 years Celine looked back without needing to read it. The need to decode Verena had driven her for years. That specific anxiety of living in proximity to a threat you cannot fully map. It was gone now. Whatever Verena was or had been or had built, it was over, and the only remaining question was what it had cost and whether any of it could be salvaged into something useful. "The names," Celine said. "Sit down," Verena said. "No." A pause. Verena looked at her hands, at the bandage, at something that existed somewhere between the two. "Lord Caron of the Eastern Reach," she said. "Lord Payette of the Brass Valley Holdings. Lord Dunmore, who controls the Aldgate Passage." She said them without inflection, without negotiation, without attaching conditions to them, now that she had already declared the conditions in the corridor, and they had been met by Celine's presence. 3 names. 3 men who had received orders rather than framing, who were positioned for action rather than consideration, who would move on a timeline that had nothing to do with what had just happened in the council chamber. Celine filed the names. "How far along?" "Caron has already moved troops to his border position. He was the first contact and the most committed. He believes the empire is fracturing and he wants the eastern territories independent before someone stable takes the throne. Verena paused. He was not wrong about the fracturing. He was wrong about the timing. Because you're in a cell. Because you're not dead. Verena looked up at her then, directly, with the flat eyes that had always seemed to Celine to be looking at a version of the world that had been stripped of everything except its mechanics. I want to tell you something. Tell me. I did not hate you. She said it the way she said everything, without performance, without asking for anything back. I want to be clear about that, because it matters for the accuracy of the record, and I have spent my life caring about accuracy. I did not hate you. I assessed you. For years I assessed you as a manageable variable. You were quiet and careful and contained contained things do not disrupt architecture. Celine said nothing. The mistake I made, Verena continued, was not underestimating your capability. I knew your capability. I had known it since you were 16 years old, and I watched you navigate your father's court with a precision that you had taught yourself with no instruction and no model to work from. She paused. The bandaged hand shifted slightly in her lap. The mistake was assuming that your capability would remain in service of survival, that you would keep using it to endure rather than to act. Her eyes did not move from Celine's face. I did not account for the execution square. Celine stood in the cold of the cell and felt the weight of what was being offered. Not apology, not remorse in any conventional form, but the specific accounting of a strategic mind doing its final honest audit. It was the most Verena had ever given her. It was also, she understood, the most Verena knew how to give. The Eastern Lords, Celine said. Is there anything else I need to know about their positioning? Karen has a secondary agreement with a weapons merchant out of the northern pass towns. He has been stockpiling for 4 months. He anticipated a longer timeline for the Empire's fracture, and he over-prepared. Verena's voice was still level. That stockpile is at a way station called Brent Ford, 3 miles east of the Aldgate Passage. If Kael's riders reach it before Karen's men can move it, it significantly reduces his capacity for a sustained engagement. Celine studied her. Why are you giving me this? Verena was quiet for a moment. It was a different quiet than her usual silences, which were always operational, always the pause of a mind that was moving. This one had something else in it, something older and less constructed. Because it is the accurate thing to do, she said finally. I built something that should not have been built, and I built it as well as I knew how, and it failed because the variable I dismissed turned out to be the load-bearing wall. She looked at her hands again. The least I can do is give you the tools to finish it cleanly. Celine looked at her stepmother for a long time. At the silver hair and the straight spine, and the 61 years of architecture and calculation, and the specific loneliness of a person who had spent 4 decades in a room full of people and had never once let any of them see the inside of the building. She thought about her father, about the 12-year-old girl who had stood in a doorway and watched Verena enter their house, and had known, with the instinct of a child who has not yet learned to distrust her own instincts, that something fundamental had just changed. She thought about what it had cost that girl to grow up in proximity to someone who treated her as a variable, what it had taken from her and what it had, in the strange and terrible economy of adversity, also built. She would not thank Verena for that. She would not offer the conversion of suffering into gratitude because suffering did not deserve conversion, and gratitude was not what she felt. What she felt was something more complicated and less satisfying and more true. The particular human experience of standing in front of someone who hurt you and understanding them fully and finding that understanding did not resolve the hurt, but made it something you could carry rather than something that carried you. Stay alive for the inquiry, Celine said. Tell it what you told me. All of it. Verena said nothing. Celine turned and walked out of the cell. The ride to the Brennan Pass took 4 hours. They rode hard and the land rose around them as they went east, the flat country of the capital's reach giving way to the ridge terrain that created the natural corridor of the pass, the geography that had made it a strategic point for 3 dynasties and would make it one for whoever came after. The sky was gray and high, and the wind came down off the northern ridges with the cold edge of late season, and Celine rode into it with her face open to the cold and felt it against her skin like something that was simply true. She had given Kael the names and the information about Brent Ford before they left. and he had sent 3 riders ahead at a pace that would put them at the way station before Karen's men could be alerted. He had done it without discussion, with the efficiency of a man who received intelligence and used it, and she had watched him give the orders and had felt the particular clarity of a problem that had a solution being given its solution. She rode beside him now, and Darius rode on the other side, and the 3 of them were largely silent in the way of people who have said the necessary things and are letting the distance and the cold do the rest. At the second hour, Darius said, "I need to say it." She looked at him. His face was wind-cut and tired and had in it the expression she had been carrying since the council chamber, the expression of a man looking at the architecture of his own decisions from the outside for the first time. "You don't have to," she said. "I know I don't." He held her gaze. His horse moved under him, steady on the road. 6 years. 6 years I had a woman beside me who was the most capable person in that court, and I used her absence as convenience. His voice was even, but it was costing him something. "I did not look at you. I looked past you. And when they told me you'd poisoned her, part of me, the part that had been looking past you for 6 years, found it easier to believe than to question." He paused. "That's what I need to say. That it was easier. Not that I was deceived, that I chose the easier thing." Celine listened to this. Let it fully arrive. "I know," she said. "That's all you're going to say. That's all that's true right now." She looked at the road ahead, at the ridgeline against the gray sky. "What happens after this, with the Empire and the court and whatever the inquiry produces, that's going to take time to resolve. What happened between us is going to take longer, if it resolves at all." She glanced at him. "What I know is that you came to Dreth. You came knowing it was dangerous and you came anyway, and when Vorant turned out to be Verena's, you didn't fold. That's not nothing." He was quiet for a long moment. "It's not enough either." "No," she said. "It's not, but it's a place to start from." He nodded once, slowly, and looked at the road, and she looked at the road, and between them something that had been a long time dying, finished dying, and something that did not yet have a shape began the process of becoming one. They reached the Brennan Pass at midday. Lord Karen had already moved his column into the approach, which meant he had received word faster than she had estimated. Either he had a source in the capital she had not accounted for, or he had been positioned closer than Verena had indicated. Either way, the column was there, 300 mounted and another 200 on foot, arrayed in the pass entrance with the specific posture of men who had been given an order and were waiting for confirmation to execute it. Cale looked at the column for a moment from the ridge above the pass. 3-1, he said. "Roughly," she said. "Good," he said, and she looked at him, and he was looking at the column with the gray eyes and the expression of a man who had done the calculation and found it acceptable. Not comfortable. Acceptable. There was a difference, and understanding the difference was the thing that separated men who were genuinely capable from men who performed capability. She thought about what it meant, standing on a ridge above a 3-1 situation with a scarred northern king who found it acceptable, and feeling in her own chest not fear exactly, but something clear and cold and load-bearing. She had spent 25 years surviving. She had done it carefully and quietly and at enormous personal cost. And it had kept her alive, and it had made her very good at reading rooms, and it had not, until the execution square, taught her the difference between surviving and living. This, she thought, this is the difference. Standing on the ridge rather than being managed toward the exit. Darius pulled up beside them, looked at the column, looked at Kael, looked at Celine. "If we ride down there under a flag," Darius said, "and Karen holds, we've lost the pass and the approach, and we're taking that column from behind." "Karen won't hold," Celine said. "You're certain." "Karen is a man who took Verena's orders because he believed she would win. He doesn't have an independent ideology about Eastern independence. That's the story he told himself to make the alliance comfortable. What he has is a calculation, and the calculation depended on the Empire fracturing." She looked at the column below. "The Empire is not fracturing. His patron is in a cell. His stockpile is gone." She paused. "He's standing in that pass because he doesn't know what else to do yet. Men in that condition will take an exit. And if you're wrong," Kael said, "then you and your 30 riders will have a very specific problem, and I will be part of it." She looked at him. "I'm not wrong." He held her gaze for one long, steady moment, the gray eyes doing the things she had learned to recognize as his version of trust. Not the performed trust of someone who had decided to believe her, but the earned trust of a man who had watched her be right enough times that the process was becoming automatic. "Ride together?" he said. "All three. They need to see all three." They rode down into the pass. Uptet. Karen was a large man in late middle age with the specific bearing of someone who had been told he was significant for so long that he had organized his body around the information. He rode to the front of his column when he saw them coming, and he looked at the three riders and at Kael's men positioned on the ridge above, and at the space where the logic of his situation was supposed to be, and found it wasn't there anymore. Celine stopped 10 feet from him. Kael on her right, Darius on her left. "Lord Karen," she said. Her voice carried in the pass. "The council inquiry is open. Verena is in custody. Vorant is in custody. The witnesses who testified against me have recanted." She let that settle. "And your stockpile at Brent Ford is in the hands of King Kael's riders." Karen looked at her. He was doing the calculation she had predicted he would do, the rapid reassembly of a situation whose foundations had just been removed. "The Eastern Territory's grievances," he started, "are real," Darius said. It silenced Karen more effectively than any interruption could have, because it was not the expected response. "The trade restrictions that have disadvantaged the Eastern holdings for the past 4 years were council decisions made under influence that is no longer operative. They will be reviewed." He held Karen's gaze with the flat authority of a man who had arrived somewhere honest. "That review requires you to be present for it, not deployed in a pass." Karen looked at the ridge, at Kael's men, at the column behind him, which had not moved but had the distributed uncertainty of people who were waiting to find out what they were doing. He looked at Celine. "If the inquiry is genuine," he said. "It is," she said. "And the review of the trade restrictions." "It is," Darius said. Karen held the position for one more moment. The specific position of a man who has committed himself to a direction and is finding a way to change it that does not require him to admit he was wrong, but simply acknowledges that the ground changed. It was a face-saving mechanism, and she let him have it because face-saving mechanisms kept men from doubling down out of pride. And pride in a man with 300 mounted behind him was a more immediate problem than his accuracy about his own decision-making. "Stand the column down," Karen said over his shoulder. The pass released its held breath. They returned to the capital at dusk. The city looked the same. That was always the thing that surprised her after days of events that should have changed the visible landscape. That the rooftops and streets and the river 3 miles out were entirely indifferent to what had happened among the people living above and beside them. The capital was still the black stone and scattered torchlight and the dense geography she had memorized in 6 years of watching it from windows. It held no record of what the past 3 days had made of her. She would have to carry that herself. The council inquiry began the following morning. Muriel testified first. She came in on her own feet, still pale from whatever she had been given, but standing under her own authority. And she testified for 4 hours in a voice that did not waver, and did not perform remorse, and did not embellish. She gave dates and instructions and specific conversations with the particular precision of a woman who had spent years in the company of a strategic mind and had absorbed the habit of accuracy, whether she intended to or not. She named Verena. She named Vorant. She named 3 council members who had known the testimony was false and had counted the votes without asking questions. Celine sat in the chamber gallery and listened and felt the specific satisfaction, not of victory, but of truth occupying the space where a lie had been. Truth was not always satisfying, but it was often ugly and complicated, and it did not resolve the things that had been done in its absence. But it was better than the alternative in the way that clean wounds were better than infected ones. Not pleasant, but honest, and honest things could heal. Verena testified on the second day. She sat before the council in the same posture she had held in the cell, spine straight, chin level, hands still, and she answered every question with the accuracy she had promised. She did not minimize, she did not seek sympathy. She constructed, in the testimony of half a day, the complete architecture of what she had built and why. And the council sat with it the way you sit with a structure that has been revealed to be what it was. In silence, in the specific discomfort of people who had been inside it without knowing, who had been used as materials by a mind that was more precise than theirs. At the end of the second day, the council voted. Verena was convicted on 7 counts. The sentence was not death. Celine had spoken privately with Darius on that point, had said only what was true, which was that execution produced martyrs and imprisonment produced records, and Verena was more valuable as a record. The sentence was permanent removal from court and exile to the northern estates, under supervision for the remainder of her life. Verena received the sentence with the same still face she had received everything. As the guards turned her toward the door, she looked across the chamber at Celine, one last time, with the pewter eyes. Celine held her gaze. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing left that needed saying, and they both understood that, and the understanding was the most honest exchange they had ever had. Then Verena walked out, and the door closed, and the chapter ended. 3 weeks later, the Eastern trade restrictions were reviewed and restructured. Karen attended the sessions with the careful participation of a man who had decided to earn his way back to legitimacy through usefulness. Darius ran the sessions with a quality she had not seen from him before, a kind of deliberate openness, a willingness to hear the grievances rather than manage them. It was not comfortable for him. She could see that. He did it anyway. She watched him from the gallery on the first day and felt something that was neither the old resentment nor the new clarity, but something in the territory between them. A complicated residue of shared history that had survived everything it had been through and was waiting to find out what it was going to become. She did not yet know. She let it wait. Kael came to her in the East Garden on the 4th morning, the garden she had walked in for 6 years because it was the part of the fortress grounds where she could see the full sky without a wall on every side. He came without announcement, which she had come to expect from him, and stood beside her at the low garden wall and looked at the view she was looking at. The city spread below in the early morning light, the geometry of rooftops softened by distance and the low haze of cook fires. The river was silver at this hour. The ridge country to the north was clear against the blue sky, each line exact. "The inquiry closes tomorrow," he said. "I know. After that I ride north." He was looking at the view, not at her. The northern territories need their king present rather than on a southern road for the next season. She nodded. "That makes sense. You could come north," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her now with the gray eyes that she had spent 3 days learning to read and had not finished the education. He said it the same way he said everything, without decoration, without the performance of casual, just the thing he meant presented with the expectation that she could handle it. "You're not asking me to come north because you need me to," she said. "No. You're asking because you want me to." "Yes." She looked at him for a long time, at the scar and the still face and the man underneath both, who had ridden into a foreign capital and halted in execution and offered her useful honesty when the alternative would have been comfortable management, who had stood on a ridge above a 3-to-1 column and called it acceptable, who had held Vorant against a wall without heat and let him understand his own position without requiring the drama of force. She thought about what she was. About the woman who had stood in the execution square 3 weeks ago with her spine straight and her father's bracelet on her wrist and no weapon and no plan except the cold determination not to make it easy for them. About the woman who had walked into Verena's cell alone. About the woman who had ridden down into the Brennan Pass and told Karen his calculation was over. She had spent 6 years becoming very good at enduring. She had spent 3 days discovering that endurance was a foundation, not a destination. That what you built on it was the actual question, the one she had not had time to ask while she was occupied with surviving. She looked at the northern ridge against the sky. "Not yet," she said. "There is work here that is not finished, and I will not leave it unfinished because the alternative is easier." She paused. "But north is not a direction I'm closing." Kael held her gaze with the particular steadiness that was simply his nature, the steadiness of a man who had never needed urgency to make a thing real, who understood that the most durable things were built at their own pace rather than the pace of wanting. "Then it stays open," he said. They stood at the garden wall in the early light, and the city moved below them, and the river was silver, and the northern ridge was clear, and she felt for the first time in a very long time the specific weight of a future that was not designed by someone else's hand. It was heavy. It was entirely hers. She had not been given it. She had built it from the materials available, from 6 years of careful watching, From the cold nights and the managed silences and the copper bracelet worn every day as the only continuous thread back to a man who had loved her when she was 7 years old and had not lived to see what she became. She had built it from the execution square and the northern road and the cell with Verena and the ridge above the pass and every choice she had made in the spaces where choices were available. The woman who had been condemned to die before sunrise had not survived by becoming something harder, though she was harder. Had not survived by becoming colder, though she carried cold well now. She had survived by finally, at the last possible moment, becoming the truest version of what she had always been. Someone who paid attention, who held steady, who did not confuse the architecture she was given with the architecture she could build. There was a difference. She knew it now with the certainty of someone who had paid for it at full price. That was enough. It was, in the honest accounting of a life, more than enough. She looked at the river and felt the morning and let the weight of what she had come through settle into her body like a stone finding the bottom of still water, all the way down, fully, without resistance. It was not peace exactly. It was something more useful than peace. It was clarity. It was the specific, undeceived stillness of a woman who knew exactly where she stood and had chosen to stand there. Below, the city continued. Above, the sky continued. Beside her, a northern king stood in the morning light and said nothing more, because nothing more needed saying. And that, too, was enough.